All right, we are here to enjoy ourselves at the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for September 17th, 2024. We are at the pre-meeting. Commissioners Hatch and Wynn are excused for today. All other commissioners are present. Um, Any questions on agenda items before we move into training? Okay, let's just go straight to training then.
Great. So today we're going to talk about conditional use permits. That's the training that Larry Gardner had me provide today. We did something similar about a year ago. I'm going to take a slightly different direction this time. Good reminder every year to go over conditional use permits. I think it's the conditional use permits are probably the most misunderstood type of application amongst the general public. I think sometimes the general public thinks that a conditional use is kind of a discretionary conditional use that the city can grant or not. I think even in other cities, some planning commission members probably misunderstand that, but um, obviously present company accepted. As we know, conditional use is simply a permitted use with where we have to do kind of a health and safety analysis, right? And and really, if government can do any one thing, it's reasonable health and safety, right? And so this is, I think, at the heart of what cities do. Um, and in particular, we're, I think in layman's terms, if I were to describe the conditional use permit process, I would probably say we identify specific health and safety issues, and then we identify specific remedies for those issues, right? And then, of course, we have to have fancy terms of art to make it sound mysterious and mystical and cool. And or we do it just to because lawyers made up terms or the state legislature made up terms. Whatever the case may be, we have fancy terms called reasonably anticipated detrimental effects and then reasonable conditions, right? That's what we're nailing down. But really, it's just what are the health and safety potential problems and what are the potential remedies, right? Um, and those are our terms of art that we use. And the thing to remember is whenever we go through a conditional use permit process, that really there's only two main outcomes. There's a third, really super highly unlikely third possible outcome. Which in my entire career, I've only seen twice that somebody can do it. And that's to deny a conditional use, right? It's so rare. But in theory, it can happen, right? But normally you're looking at, are you going through and not finding any detrimental effects at all and thus no conditions? Or is it B, you're finding that there's one or more detrimental effects and you're finding conditions that you can place to reasonably mitigate those detrimental effects, right? It doesn't mean eliminate, but reasonably mitigate them. And like I say, in those rare instances, if you've gone through a really comprehensive process and you found one or more detrimental effects and there's really no condition that can reasonably mitigate it, in theory, and I say in theory because it's so super rare, you could deny, but in my view, if you deny a conditional use, you need to go through a really extensive and thorough process to prove, no, we looked at every condition possible and we just can't find one that can reasonably mitigate this detrimental effect or effects.
So Duncan, a question on that
Yeah.
is, we've got an application before us, conditional use. We have identified a certain number of detrimental effects associated with that. At what point does it become, is it the planning commission's and city's responsibility to figure out how to get past those versus the owners or the project owners? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I don't think it's a problem to solicit the assistance, so to speak, of the applicant and say, look, we've identified this detrimental effect or effects. We're going through these conditions, Mr. Applicant, do you have a way that you see where there's a condition that could be imposed, which would reasonably mitigate it. Because a lot of times, I think it's not necessarily staff, it's not necessarily planning commission. A lot of times it is the applicant, right? I remember we had an application for an indoor shooting range. And the applicant, I think, came up with the conditions necessary to mitigate the noise, the smells, I don't know what it all was. But they already had all of the ways, and the fact they've done it at other locations or whatever. So we had, and then the advantage to that situation was there, because that's one of the other challenges, is sometimes we want to make sure that we have substantial evidence in the record, right? That shows the detrimental effect and shows that the condition is useful. It could be our own police department, it could be a traffic study, it probably shouldn't just be a random comment at the podium, right? Unless it's somebody that's an expert in that area, even though that is part of the record. And so in that instance, a few years ago when that happened, the applicant came with that record, right? Here's the other stores, the other indoor shooting ranges, other locations where we use this technology that suppress sounds and smells and dangerous vapors, whatever it was. And here's our proof that this would work. Here's what we're willing to voluntarily, on our own initiative, put in and install at this location. And then, so in a sense, that applicant provided the substantial record for us, admitted to the detrimental effect, identified some conditions, and in that instance, if I remember correctly, I think we just accepted it, right? Which is great, right? If somebody, the challenge, so I think that's responsive to your question, right? So even the applicant can come up with a possible condition. I think the toughest situation, though, is where nobody can come up with the condition, neither the applicant nor the city staff or planning commission, so like I say, it's rare, right? Because normally if an applicant is motivated enough, he or she's going to find a condition, right? So
So one other question on that is
Yeah.
who follows up on the conditions afterward? Certain ones are going to be easy, right? Conditions based on building or site plan or those kinds of things that are going to be wrapped up within the inspection of the site plan and the structure. But for example, some of these facilities that we've had where there's an anticipated detrimental effect of too many people in a structure or close to a structure late at night in a party type setting, and so there needed to be some form of security. And so the detrimental effect was identified. The follow-up condition was they will hire off-duty police officers to handle it. Everything went through, but then who then mandate
Follows
or
up,
who requires that? So if these individuals go ahead and do it, great. But if they don't, the city's not following up on that regularly or waiting for a complaint from the public to then go out and issue a notice, or how does that end up playing into it?
And we do have a high volume, a high number of conditional uses. I think that's one of the toughest ones, is reception centers and the like. I know the planners are focused on enforcing a lot of these conditional uses, especially ones around water source protection zones, that kind of thing. Obviously, we don't have staff to look at every single CUP every year. We try to, I think, and Larry can chime in whenever he wants. I think we try to identify those that are the most important to follow up on any given time. Obviously, a lot of what we do is reactionary. We do respond to when somebody thinks that there's a problem, and they may not realize it's potentially breaching or violating a conditional use permit, but they know there's a problem. They report it to police or whoever. But what are your thoughts, Larry?
Well, we've had several over the last probably year or two that have been complaint based and for other reasons. And then we work with code enforcement, or in the case of the reception center, with the police department. And where there's a conditional use permit, um, that is probably the easiest thing to revoke, because they're not living up to their conditions at all. And, but that, they have to have that conditional use permit to have a business license. And so we've had the one reception center was obvious, the conditions of approval, they needed to close down at a certain time. They were violating that. They could have no alcohol. They were violating that. Noise things, they were violating that. They were just violating all their conditions. And so the evidence was easy to gather because the police were going there so often. And once the police would give a complaint to us, we would take it seriously and then document it all and revoke. And without the conditional use permit, they would have to, their business license is easier to revoke also. And so, but the detrimental effects by the planning commission were identified were spot on. This is what's going to be the detrimental effect to the community: loud noise, alcohol, fights in the parking lot, that type of thing. And it's not only reception center. We've had some recently where a conditional use permit was issued 25 years ago for outdoor storage on concrete and asphalt. And we go out and they've expanded onto an adjacent field, which is basically a 1-inch layer of gravel, but it also happens to be in a wellhead protection zone, and that type of thing. And so we have a couple that we're under enforcement right now. There was one that was a dust problem. And so, by and large, the majority of them are complaint based. But that's the first thing we look for is a conditional use permit, and what conditions were established. Now, some, in the last few years, we've honed in really on detrimental effects. And that's the only thing that we put on a conditional use permit. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, it used to be all kinds of things, site plan issues, and it was just kind of an omnibus bill that they would put everything in a condition, and we don't put code references in conditions of approval. We only put what the detrimental effect is. And so, but do we police it? Do we inspect it? No. The newer ones we do within 6 months and a year. The older ones, no, because I know Julie's gone through and made an extensive list, but it's manpower is an issue. So we just basically focus on the complaint-based ones. But, if the planning commission would like to see, in the future, some kind of report on the conditional use permits that you've issued, I'd be happy to do that. So.
And probably as an additional response to your question, these reception centers, I think, are always fresh on our mind, because especially these most recent ones over the last couple of years, because in order to create the record and have the information we need, we rely upon our own police department. And since our own police department created the record of how many types of reports are for those types of businesses, and they're aware of where these businesses are at, and the patrol is watching it, and it's not likely to get missed just because of their involvement, especially if some off-duty ones are providing the security service and that kind of thing. So I think we do have some built-in mechanisms to kind of ongoing track some of these main challenging types of businesses, right? But the other thing with conditional uses to keep in mind too is if we're in that category of not being able to identify any detrimental effect and thus not applying any conditions for a specific type of use, and we see that multiple times, at some point, maybe 3 or 4 times in a row, it's like, wait a minute, this use and especially in these zones, and we never find any conditions. You can put on your other hat of, instead of just being a land use authority reviewing and approving conditional use permits, you can put on your traditional planning commission hat and say, hey, maybe we ought to recommend to the council changing that use on the land use table in those couple of zones and making it a P instead of a C, right? Just make it permitted outright because the whole point is that we put a C on the land use chart if we see the potential for health and safety issues, right? But if repeatedly we're not finding any, it's either A, just random luck that it turned out that way, or B, there just really aren't any potential health and safety issues or detrimental effects. And so if there's no potential detrimental effects, it should just be permitted, right? Just a thought, right? If sometimes you see something that just doesn't seem to have any potential detrimental effect.
Commissioner Roberts had a question.
Yeah.
I just had a quick follow-up question for you, Larry. So you mentioned code enforcement. Is that who would be the primary person or entity responsible for following up on those?
Yeah,
And presumably the
yeah,
police
right
department and
now,
ours there?
they are because they generally get the complaints and they start the process of going to the administrative law judge if there's a violation or the revocation to community development department. So yeah,
Okay.
code
then-
enforcement. And then the city has also budgeted for, I think they're gonna be hiring what they call the community improvement officer or.
Right. Yeah, there's a new
New
employee,
position.
a new
So-
position that's focused on those types of
Who,
things.
I think that, you know, what Commissioner Allen and that was asking is that will be the job of that employee. So, you know, because the planners don't have the
And then
time.
one
to
other
go-
follow-up to that follow-up, does code enforcement have an easy access to see conditional use permits and whatnot?
Yeah,
like
they have
in the field?
Julie, they have Julie.
Okay, but we don't have like a database where they can pull up a property address and code
Yeah,
enforcement can see all that at a
they,
glance.
well, what we've done on our, as a GIS layer on our Esri map is every conditional use permit on every parcel is a layer on that map.
Okay, so
so
it's not necessarily like a really detailed flag, but at least they do get the knowledge that, hey, this has a conditional.
Yeah,
use
this
permit.
has a
Let's dig little
conditional use
deeper.
permit now. Is all the information contained in the Esri legend? No. They'd have to go back and ask about it because some of them, like I said, are 30 years old,
Yeah.
you know, so.
Okay,
But they do, if they can just get on the public map and see that it is a conditional use permit on
okay,
that
good, no,
property.
thanks.
Yeah, and without going through all of the city code that you can see there, part of our city code on conditional use permits does deal with the notion of appeals. Unlike other types of appeals of or potential revocations of conditional use permits can go to the Conditional Use Appeal and Revocation Authority. And so, and maybe leave it to that one screen. I'll get to it here in a sec. Oh, but yeah, you're right. Let's go to that. So where they just scrolled it to, if somebody appeals a CUP, let's say somebody speaks out against a conditional use permit and adjacent landowner or whatever, and but the CUP is granted, they can appeal it within 15 days to the Conditional Use Appeal Revocation Authority, which is a one-person administrative law judge, which we have, which the mayor has appointed basically through a contract. But after 15 days, if that appeal period is over, then it's too late to appeal it, and then it becomes locked in, so to speak. But like I said, any time thereafter, whether it's through the code enforcement process or whatever, that the city can initiate revocation proceedings if there's a allegation that the CUP recipient is not following through on all the conditions appropriately. So, yeah, and if we go down to or go back to that other page, the standards for determination. Then there's that list of 8. In every staff report that the Planning Commission gives to you on a conditional use permit application, they always jump through the hoops of those 8 criteria. And in order to indicate, because state law requires that we have some type of standards. These are our standards, right? That we go through to identify the detrimental effects and apply the conditions. And then if you scroll through to page 4, that's again the state code section you can go through if you want. The main thing is at the end of the day, at the end of the application process here in the meeting, we want to make sure that the conditions are stated on the record that reasonably relate to mitigating those detrimental effects, right? Kind of a 2-step process: identify the detrimental effects, impose conditions, and then make sure we create the right record, right? So it's not just made up, it's not just based on public comment, but it's substantiated in the record. So we always like to have hypotheticals, right? So we got 3 hypotheticals there.
Before we jump into those, Commissioner Hollingsworth's got a quick
Yeah.
question.
So question for you, on the appeals process, who can offer an appeal?
So in state code, it's anybody that, I forget the right term, but they have an interest.
They have standing?
They have standing, so to speak. There's a special term in land use for it. Yeah, an aggrieved party, I think, or something similar to that. But basically, yeah, they have some kind of standing. They're an adjacent landowner. They're at least maybe they're just a tenant that lives next door. Somehow they're affected in some way, because that's the whole notion anyway, right? Of detrimental effects is it's balancing landowner rights, or at least it's balancing an adjacent resident's rights or something like that against others. The whole notion that people have landowner rights subject to where some, others. And so an aggrieved party can make that appeal if they, under the guise probably of, okay, I understand that you identified this detrimental effect, you identified this condition. I don't believe that that condition reasonably mitigates that detrimental effect, at least not as to me, and here's why, and that would be kind of the nature of their appeal, right?
But I think they would have to do that within the appeal timeframe
Right,
after
15 days.
after the decision was issued.
Right.
Now, if someone didn't like what was happening 5 years after the fact, they couldn't appeal that.
No, right. It
Oh,
has to
but
be
yeah.
within the 15 days. Each city can determine an appeal period. A lot of cities, go as low as 10, some as high as 30. Ours is 15. And there is a default in state law, but we've specifically picked 15. All of our other land use appeals of other types of applications are pretty much 15 days as well. That's just the date that we picked.
Can I jump in with a quick question too?
Yeah.
You mentioned being able to repeal the conditional use permit based on, non-compliance or not
Right.
suitably doing that. What about in the event that a detrimental effect isn't identified prior, but comes to light after the conditional use permit goes into effect?
So the applicant hasn't reapplied or tried to change
Yeah,
their,
there's no change to it. It's
and then
just,
one's identified
think about
later,
this.
didn't think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's, that unfortunately, once a conditional use permit is approved, it's approved, right? We have to go on a condition that was approved to be able to revoke it. The one exception to that rule is that if somebody reapplies, and the way our code is written is if somebody wants to amend or change or add to their CUP, it's a whole new CUP, right? And then anytime you have a new process, you can impose anything, even if it wasn't imposed before. So that's why we have to be thorough, right? Because after the appeal period's run, we're 16 days into it. It's pretty much locked in unless somebody doesn't meet those conditions and a revocation process is started, or if they want to amend or change, which is a new CUP, then we get another bite of the apple. But yeah, the potential is if we missed it, we're probably stuck with missing it. Right? All right, so let's go to CUP hypothetical fact pattern A. This one's a metal recycling facility. It's a site plan and a CUP. It's going to be in this MP light manufacturing zone next to an R1 single family residential neighborhood. So as you know, the staff usually at least starts the process and says, hey, here's what we have identified as detrimental effects. So my first question for you is there anything in this instance, this fact pattern, other than noise, minor smells, building location, can you think of anything else that might be a detrimental effect?
Metal recycling, infestations of rodents.
Yeah. And especially if you can identify some reports or study somewhere that says that that's a type of detrimental effect that occurs generally with metal recycling facility. Yeah. Anything else? So let's start with that one. Let's say that there is a study that says that that is a detrimental effect associated with that type of facility. And I don't know what that study would show as far as a potential remedy or condition, but what do you think? If there isn't one identified and you had to kind of come up with one, so to speak, what is a potential condition for rats?
Require them to have a preventative maintenance, bait traps, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
around the area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I do at home. I have 20 mouse traps in my house,
Yeah.
so. Plus 3 sets of poison. So my condition worked at my house. Plus a cat is a good idea too. Probably not at the factory. So yeah, that's right. And the health department, Julie's talking about, probably has some standards, right? And as Larry indicated earlier, a lot of these standards that are either health department standards, city code standards, or whatever, don't necessarily need to be conditions, but we just reflect that those apply. And I'm not sure, maybe the county health department has something that way. But you're right. I mean, and maybe they already have their own methodology. And if they say, here's how we're going to take care of it, whether it's a health department standard or their own standard from other factories, and we take a look at it and appears to be appropriate, then maybe we just commit them to what they offered, right? Because a lot of this is we want to work with people, right? If there's 3 options and 2 are reasonable expense and 1 is super expensive, maybe we don't want to impose the super expensive one, right? And if somebody is offering to use a method which appears to be as good as any other, the likelihood that they'll follow through is higher, right? And then the likelihood that someone doesn't like the final approval, that likelihood goes down, right? They're going to be more committed. So, all right, what about, yeah.
I got one that's not even on your list here.
Yeah.
If you've got a metal recycling area and it's right next to a R1, how about the aesthetics? Because if I was the owner of that house and now I see this, what looks basically like a garbage dump next to my house, that would probably offend me a little bit.
Right. I mean, and we have a lot of what's in our code is to prevent those kinds of issues, right? A lot of the applications that come before you are like bay doors facing a road and that kind of thing, which in certain instances are allowed with your approval and so forth. And that's why down on building location, at least it says the fencing or wall and buffer landscaping are all in city code. So they're not technically conditions, but they may help, right? But maybe in certain instances, there's not a fencing or wall requirement. And so it's not in the code, but it still is an issue and maybe it's a condition, right? No, I think that's great. Yeah. The only challenge sometimes with aesthetics, if they're not specifically in the code, is it's harder sometimes to identify a health and safety detrimental effect, right? But no, I think that's a great point.
But I think if they could, to Jay's point, if it's a detrimental effect to the community, I think, conditions such as you don't stack the metal over a certain height. You make sure the trucks are all covered when they're coming in so they're not dropping crap all over the road, that type of thing. So you're preserving the residential nature without, you don't allow them to stack metal because some of these places will go 30, 40 feet high and you can see it
Right.
for miles.
Well, and
so-
those are not just aesthetics. They really are, the more I think about it, bona fide health and safety, because if, 40 foot tall stack of metal, if it falls on somebody, it might kill them, right? Or a tall stack of pallets could catch on fire. Well, I just noticed it's 6, so we'll end there. You can look at the other fact patterns on your own. Appreciate the discussion, and we can do more later.
Thank you very much. Any last minute questions for Duncan? Awesome. In that case, it is a little bit past 6 o'clock, so we will go ahead and enter into the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for September 17th, 2024. All commissioners, save for Commissioner Wynn and Commissioner Hatch, are present. The latter two are excused for today. We have a rip-roaring agenda for us today, so excited to jump into this. Our first agenda item is to approve the minutes from September 3rd, 2024. Any discussion or a motion? Commissioner Gonzalez.
I will go ahead and make a motion to approve minutes from September 3rd, 2024.
Commissioner Roberts.
I'll second that.
Okay, I've got a motion from Commissioner Gonzalez, second by Commissioner Roberts. Discussion on the motion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. On to agenda item number 2, the Copper Rim Phase 3B deferral agreement. Recommendation to City Council for deferral agreement with CW Land Company LLC in the City of West Jordan for Copper Rim Phase 3B landscape construction. This is a business item, so there will not be a public hearing, but we'll turn the time over to Ray for conversation.
Thank you. So this is part of the Copper Rim development, which is just west of the Smiths. Can you hear me? So here's the Smiths right here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. But the area that we're talking about is just kind of in the center of the Copper Rim development. I'll zoom in a little bit. So right in the center of the project, there's a cul-de-sac, and then there's a stub that comes off, or a spur that comes off of that cul-de-sac, which will ultimately at some point bridge over the Mountain View corridor and then tie in with 7400 South. So we don't know exactly when that's going to happen, but as you can see, the improvements have been, or all the improvements, such as the curb gutter, sidewalk, the road has actually been installed. It's been striped. The only thing that has not been installed at this point is the landscaping within the park strip. Typically what will happen is the developer will install these improvements. Once those are done, there's a warranty period, and then those improvements are, in this case, will be turned over to the city for maintenance. But we know that there's going to be a lot of construction that'll happen when that bridge is put in. So rather to install those improvements or those landscaping improvements of the park strip, only to have them kind of destroyed during that construction of that overpass. What we're doing is recommending a deferral agreement between the city and developer. Basically what it does is it just puts off the installation of those improvements for a later date. The developer would still be responsible for installing those. But I think as the agreement reads, it wouldn't be until the last phase of Copper Rim development is underway. And that should give us enough time to for the construction of that bridge to occur. But like I say, we just don't know when that is at this point, but that's the reason for the deferral agreement. So yours is basically, we put in a bunch of, there are a number of findings that have to be made as part of that. We put those in the staff report. With the engineering departments kind of taking a look at those, these improvements are typically required to be installed within, I think, a 24-month period. But it just, like I say, it just doesn't make sense at this point. So we feel that it meets those findings of fact and the criteria for approving a deferral agreement. So it has to go, these deferral agreements have to go to the planning commission. Planning commission makes a recommendation to the city council, ultimately approves that. So we think that this one's pretty straightforward.
Commissioner Thomas.
I just got one quick question. And going through the staff report, I noticed it's got a dollar amount on there. If the stuff that is required to go ahead and make those improvements goes over that, and they say, well, we've spent that money and now we're out, so what is the,
I can respond to that one. So the purpose for the dollar amount in this instance is just to give kind of the scope to the council of approximately the size of the improvements, right? But it doesn't put a cap so that if, 8 years from now, the developer's completing their last phase and now it costs 65,000 instead of approximately 40,000 even, they're going to have to pay 65,000 to put.
so
the
there's not a
improvements
cap
in.
on the dollar amount?
There's
so
no
it's
cap
just-
on the dollar amount.
okay.
Now, the thing that's a little bit confusing there is normally there would be. Most deferral agreements that we get are, let's say there's the construction of a roundabout and the developer is only responsible for half of that roundabout because it's on the edge of his development. And that's going to be built later when the adjacent development goes in. And if half the cost of the roundabout is 100,000 and he gives the city cash and says, hey, I'm done. I want to be able to walk and not, have any further responsibility. And then if later half of the roundabout is 140,000, well, the city's got to pay the other 40, right? But that's if in the traditional sense of a developer is paying his current cost for his portion right up front and then he's done, versus here, it's the construction is deferred till later. And there's no posting of money now, and then his obligation will be met later. The advantage to the developer in this instance is he doesn't have to post any money up front if the city council defers the payment till later. But the downside to the developer in this instance, he will pay for whatever the full cost is later when it goes in. Because the developer agreed to that, that's kind of the trade-off that's made, like I say, subject to council approval. So.
You may have just answered this. You clearly thought through many different options on here, and I think one on the table is we don't know exactly when we're going to cross this. Developer, just give the city the money and we'll take over that responsibility moving forward. What's keeping us from putting that in instead of a deferral agreement?
You mean instead of just having the improvements go in now? Yeah, and that was considered by the city. This is really, the choice here wasn't made so much by the developers, by the city. And what Ray was describing in part is that currently this little stretch of road, you can see that nobody fronts it, right? I mean, there's some houses that have their backs to it, but nobody goes right onto the street. So if we put and as you know, nowadays landscaping improvements are not grass, right, in the park strips. It's, xeriscaping, it's rocks and it's a shrub here and a tree there and another shrub here and another tree there kind of thing. And the idea is if nobody's living on it and nobody's watching it, and the water could have gone out for a few weeks and nobody realizes until all the trees are half dead or mostly dead. And then whatever did survive got finished off by UDOT when they, changed the approaches and had equipment going there to build the bridge. And I'm not picking on UDOT. I'm just saying that's just the general nature. You build a huge bridge and something's going to get run over that's next to it. And then we'll have wasted that money, and then the city will have to maybe pay $65,000 a few years from now to rebuild whatever was destroyed. So, and because and the curb gutter and sidewalk are already in, right, and the street, it's just these two park strips. But that was the basic idea, and the city was looking at what does the city want, and And then they told the developer, hey, here's really what we'd prefer. And we had an amenable developer who said, okay, great, we'll do that. I mean, in theory, the developer could have said, well, we'd really like to do this other thing, but so it was really, the city recommended, developer agreed, and that's kind of what we came up with. And obviously the council doesn't weigh in till kind of at the end, right? But anticipating that a council doesn't want to needlessly waste money and there's the least risk for loss of money by the city, I would assume that most likely the council would be okay with this option. But like I say, that's the final check and balances if they agree to it, right?
No, I'm absolutely supportive. I think it's perfectly fine. More just of a curiosity. I'd be supportive of that method too, if that one came back. I think
Yeah.
it's,
But I still think
all
it's
good.
helpful to have the dollar amount because that's the other thing the council needs to know. Is it something really small like 10,000? Is it something really big like 500,000? Or is it kind of small to medium size like 40,000, right? It gives them kind of the general scope because maybe they wouldn't be as inclined to defer the construction of something that was $500,000. I don't know, right?
Ray, do you have the proposed motion? Okay, further discussion or a motion? Commissioner Hollingsworth,
I move that the planning commission forward a favorable recommendation to the city council to approve the proposed deferral agreement for landscaping improvement on Verdigris Drive, Copper Rim Phase 3B subdivision.
Commissioner Thomas?
I'll second that motion.
Okay, we've got a motion of Commissioner Hollingsworth, a second from Commissioner Thomas. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Moving on to our final item and only public hearing for this evening, the Highlands Landing Retail at 7739 South, 5600 West, a preliminary site plan and administrative conditional use permit for restaurant fast food in the SC2 zone. JM West Assets Utah LLC with TC Kruger, the applicant. Is the applicant here? Please come on up to the podium and present your application for us.
I'm Chad Bailey, Develop Architects. I'm representing the applicant. Well, so what we've got proposed here is a retail and single drive-through building. The owner, the applicant, franchises in Jersey Mike's. So that's where the drive-through is going to be. It's just there on the east side, which is the bottom of your page. That's where the drive-through window is going to be. They do have a tenant under lease that is a nail salon, and then there's still some vacant space for a third space. I think we've been working with the planning department. I think we've dotted our I's on this one, but I really just showed up in case there were any questions or concerns, and I don't know. I'm on my local planning commission, so sometimes it's nice to have the applicant there just to settle anything. So.
Well, I appreciate it. Is it similar setup then to what's just to the south with the Starbucks and the hair cutting place?
Yeah, it's probably more similar to like the hair cutting place. I mean, Starbucks likes to brand their corner and do all of that. If you wanted to look at some of the elevations, the building is just, it's homegrown, I guess. It's not branded, so having a Jersey Mike sign on the building is kind of all it's going to be. There's like a Culver's next door that's gray and blue and all of that. So a little bit of our design was to just make it a little bit more subdued, make it a little bit more attractive to approach and drive by.
Awesome. Questions for the applicant? All right, that was pretty simple. We'll call you up if there's any further
Okay,
questions.
I'll be here.
Thanks. Ray, this is you again.
So I'll just walk you through a couple of things here. Just to give you an idea of where it is, you probably already figured it out, but this is the Culvers, this is the Smiths on 7800 South, 56 West. It's this future land use map, it's community commercial, so it fits within that designation. The zoning is SC2. Again, it's permitted use in that zone. This is just the subdivision plat that was that was approved. So what you're looking at tonight are two things. One is the conditional use for the restaurant, fast food. And typically in these instances, and the reason it's the conditional use, I think, is sometimes these are located up close to residential areas with the drive-throughs. You get the lights, you get the noise from the ordering panel, and then you get the traffic that's generated by the use. So this is in a commercial area. We just don't see there's plenty of stacking area for the vehicles. There's plenty of separation for pedestrians on the sidewalk. There's pedestrian connection up through the north to a future for a sidewalk that'll be constructed. It meets the parking requirements. We don't have a detailed landscaping plan at this point. That's not required until final approval. But we'll make sure that it complies with the code requirements on that. So the other thing you're looking at tonight, in addition to the conditional uses, for preliminary site plan approval. And then it would be an administrative final approval when it comes back in. The site the access to the site is adequate. It's just on a shared driveway or shared access off of 5600 West, and you'll be able to access the site from private streets or driveways, whatever, off of the east side and then through the adjoining property to the south. So our recommendation on this item is for approval, subject just to meeting those requirements that are listed in the staff report. We did, on this one, on the conditional use, we just couldn't find anything that we could tie a use to. So, I mean, tie a condition to.
All right, questions for staff? Hey, point out on here really quickly the direction of traffic flow through the drive-through.
It will be this way. Counterclockwise, it'll be counterclockwise. The drive-through window is right here.
sorry.
Can you see that?
Okay. So they have not only the stacking in the entire drive-through, but through the front of the parking lot and then back and around before.
Yep.
Okay. All right, sounds good. No other questions? Okay, this is a public hearing. It's been noticed as such, so we will open this up to the public. If there are any questions, if you're online, you can press *9 to raise your hand. When called on, you press *6 to unmute, and then you'd have 3 minutes. If you're here, feel free to come on up and present your comments.
There is one caller on. I don't know if that's anybody, so. They haven't raised their hand, but it is from a phone.
All right, I'll give another, 5 seconds? Countdown, 4, 3, 2. All right, no takers. We will close the public hearing and bring this back to the Planning Commission for further discussion or a motion. Commissioner Thomas.
If there's no questions, I'll go ahead and make the motions. Okay, there's 2 motions, so we'll go with the first one. Conditional use permit. I move that the Planning Commission approve the conditional use permit for the restaurant fast food general for a new commercial building located on 0.8 acres at 7739 South, 5600 West, subject to all conditions and requirements of approval.
Commissioner Gonzalez?
I will second that.
Okay, motion from Commissioner Thomas, second from Commissioner Gonzalez. Further discussion on the motion? All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Commissioner Thomas.
I'll go with the second one. This is for the preliminary site plan. I move that the Planning Commission approve the preliminary site plan for the new commercial building located on 0.797 acres of land at 7914 South, 5600 West, subject to all requirements of approval.
Commissioner Roberts.
I'll second that.
Okay, motion by Commissioner Thomas, second by Commissioner Roberts. Further discussion on the motion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Commissioner Thomas.
I'll make a motion that we adjourn.
We are adjourned.